Okay, this is lecture 6.1. This time we'll be talking about sexuality. So, we will talk about sexual orientation and the range of human sexual orientations. We will be talking about related concepts, and we'll also be touching on some sexual outliers and subcultures. Should be interesting. So, sexual orientation is the term that we use to describe effectively who you want to have sex with. That's not a perfect definition, but it's a pretty good definition. So just a reminder, sex is your biological condition. Gender is the behavior that you exhibit to express your gender identity, which is often tied with your sex, but not always. And then sexual orientation describes who you want to have sex with. Some commonly discussed sexual orientations, or the more common ones, are heterosexual, homosexual, and bisexual. That is incredibly basic, and I will be going into much greater detail here in a few minutes. Really, a lot of modern study of the scientific study of sex can be taken back to Alfred Kinsey and the Kinsey scale. Kinsey showed that sexual orientation is a continuum. Kinsey did his research in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, and he found that human sexual behavior ranges on a scale of 0 to 6, 0 being exclusively heterosexual, 6 being exclusively homosexual, and 3 being equally heterosexual and homosexual. Kinsey pointed out that sexual orientation may change over the life course, right? So if you consider yourself entirely heterosexual at the age of 25, it is possible that by the age of 50 or maybe even 30 or whatever, you could shift in that, right? So another thing Kinsey pointed out is that has been discussed in this type of research since Kinsey is that most bisexual people are not actually perfect threes. Most bisexual people have preferences. So most bisexual people will be 2 or 4s and be predominantly heterosexual with incidental homosexuality or predominantly homosexual with incidental heterosexuality. Also, there have been discussions that people that consider themselves exclusively heterosexual or homosexual may have moments in their life when they veer into either 1s for heterosexual people or 5s for homosexual people. The whole point of all of this, without getting overly complex, is that humans are dynamic sexual beings, and what we think of as our sexual orientation may and is capable of shifting over our life course regardless of what we actually think about ourselves, which is a bit of a mind blower. Now, there are many terms for the gay community. The most common term used these days, I guess, is LGBT. That's a relatively established term, but there are more letters to it than just that. You might, when you see LGBT, you may see it might be LGBTI, LGBTA. The most common one that I've seen is LGBTQ, sometimes LGBT+. All of these extra letters, obviously LGBT stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. All of these letters are thrown in there in the name of inclusivity, right? Because originally it was known as the LG movement or the LGB movement, and then a T for transgender person was put on there, right? So every letter in the acronym is intended to be inclusive, and that's it. And from an outsider perspective, it can appear silly, and sometimes it does get a little nonsensical. But all of those letters are attempts to include people in the community to the greatest degree possible, and you'll see that as we comb through kind of this. So let's go through effectively what are those extra letters, right? The I, A, P, Q, Q. Intersex people are people born with a combination of both parts. And this can be caused by a range of biological conditions. So this person is not absolutely clearly male or absolutely clearly female. There's some variation possibly in their genitals or other parts of their body. These people were once known as being hermaphrodites. That is both an archaic and an insulting term now, namely because the reason we use hermaphrodite is not just a medical, it's a biological term used to describe non-human entities, right? So we don't want to be calling humans like that. Um, Intersex people represent about 0.05% of the population, which doesn't sound like much, but for example, I live in a city of 500,000 people, right? In a city of 500,000 people, that means there are around 2,000 intersex people living in my city. That's a lot of people. That's a good substantial number of people. That is certainly enough for a convention, right? Um, Another thing to point out is that many intersex people don't know they're intersex until later in life, and this is kind of ghastly because of the way that happens. Is that traditionally uh, intersex children, when they were born, were given what was called corrective surgery. I use big quotes around that corrective to effectively stitch up their vaginas or cut off their penises, right, to make them what was seen to be an appropriate gender. So people live their lives with this surgery having been done on them, thinking that they're one sex or another sex, and then sometimes things come up later in life, possibly surrounding fertility or whatever, and they find out that this thing was done to them, which obviously would be just incredibly traumatizing. A note on this flag: this is generally agreed intersex flag. Within the LGBT community, there are, people really like flags, and many subgroups adopt their own subgroup flag. I have a couple of these in this presentation. There are way more than what I've included in this presentation, but I only really include the flag if it appeared to be something that's generally accepted. There are a whole lot of very artistic but generally accepted flags out there. I just wanted to point that out. Asexual people are people who are not driven by sex. That doesn't mean that the asexual person doesn't want romance, that they don't want intimacy, and that they would never even have sex. It doesn't mean that. What it means that asexual people are not driven by sex the way those of us who are driven by sex are. Online communities have made it much easier for asexual people to find each other and to figure themselves out too. But the exact number of asexual people is relatively hard to calculate. It's thought that it may be like intersex, under 1% of the population. But this is a relatively new identity, and many asexual people may be in relationships for non-sexual reasons, right? And many might not necessarily realize that they are asexual, but just that their partner wants sex a whole lot more than they do, right? So effectively, because of social reasons that are kind of working themselves out in our society, asexuality isn't talked about all that much because in the general population it's not understood all that well. Yeah, this is a group that we will know a whole lot more about in the not too distant future. Allies, then, are heterosexual sympathizers or friends of the LGBT community. The last presentation in this set of presentations is exclusively about being an ally and what allies are. Allies benefit from heterosexual privilege because they are straight, but they often identify with the LGBT community for one reason or another. Maybe because they have close friends in the LGBT community, maybe because they have family members, something like that, or they just have a strong sense of social justice. There is some controversy over how much allies are part of the LGBT community. And those are very interesting and hard conversations to have. I've been part of some of those. I've considered myself an ally. Oh God, I'm feeling old, for about 20 years now, and it's still something I think about. Like, what is my role in that community? And we'll talk about this more in this lecture and future lectures as well. I recently discovered what's calling itself an allies flag. I don't include it here because some of the whole flag thing is obviously people trying to make money on things like Cafe Press or whatever. It doesn't feel appropriate yet. Maybe one day we will have like a really well recognized allies flag. At this point, I don't think I would want one, quite frankly. The term queer is used to relate to the LGBT community. In general, it is a good catch-all term because there are many people in the LGBT community that don't feel especially associated with any of those letters, right? So queer is a good catch-all. But because it is a reclaimed slur, there is some controversy over how to use it or how not to use it. If you feel uncomfortable referring to the LGBT community as the queer community, which you could use those as synonyms, if you feel uncomfortable with the word, simply don't use it. That's the best advice for anyone relating to words like that, right? Anything that used to be a slur. If you don't feel comfortable with it, if you think it might make somebody else uncomfortable, don't use it. Questioning is another cue related to the LGBT community. Questioning is for people who are questioning their sexuality, and this is often used to describe LGBT youth, right? Or straight youth who associate with the community. It allows young people, or maybe even older people, to explore their sexual identity, to explore their sexual orientation, to question that, and allows effectively as a buffer into the community for those that want to explore that for themselves. Now let's talk about a few related concepts. Now this is an area of social as far as social movements go that is changing incredibly quickly. In the last decade, this concept of non-binary, especially among young people, has really taken off. This is a person who feels that their gender identity cannot be placed into either male or female or another category, right? They don't feel that their identity matches up with any of those. And then a related concept is a gender fluid person, a person who feels that their gender identity is capable of shifting from moment to moment, right? So, and those are different concepts, right? A non-binary person doesn't feel like they fit into any identity, while a gender fluid person feels that their identity or the way they express gender can change around relatively quickly. And these are relatively new phenomena. And as we talk about these phenomena, and this has happened in the past, it will happen in the future, maybe these ideas will fade away. Maybe. Or maybe, on the other hand, it may completely change the way we perceive the LGBT community. Because I'm sure that many young people today that identify themselves as gender fluid, you take that back 50 years, they might have just called themselves gay, or they might have just called themselves maybe bisexual. Bisexuality wasn't really a recognized thing until, really recognized and respected until the late 1990s. That's a big deal. That's a big change. Preferred pronouns are another related concept. So because gender identities have become dramatically more complex and dynamic, social conventions are struggling to keep up. So because of this, pronoun identification is becoming part of introducing yourself. On my UNM emails, I have my preferred pronouns listed there. he, him, his. Might be that's like a tag you can put on something. Um, and these feel clunky, right? There are buttons given out, and you can wear your preferred pronoun button, and everyone can know what pronoun matches your gender identity to the best, right? And this feels awkward to many of us now because this is a new part of our society and it's shifting. And many people growing up just always assumed that he's would be he's and she's would be she's and that would be it, and we would never talk about it. And to talk about it now is challenging, right? And it's difficult. Um, this I don't see. I think this is going to be a big area of change in our society in coming decades, and it will become dramatically easier. Is the solace I can give to you if you're a little weirded out by it. We'll figure a way out. Now let's talk about some outliers and subcultures. So, just a reminder from a different time in the course. A subculture is a group that has its own cultural definitions and understandings that are separate from those of the dominant culture. A subculture typically coexists with the dominant culture, as opposed to a counterculture. So, subcultures usually are totally fine with what people in the mainstream do, they just do their own thing. Now, many subcultures have sexual components. Those components do not always lead to sex. Some examples we'll talk about here in a few minutes. But specifically right now, right here in this conversation, we are talking about subcultures that do have sexual components. But before we get into that, we need to discuss technological determinism. Because, definition there, human behavior is dictated by the technology available to us. So, the technology we have dictates how we shop, how we work, and how we have sex, or who we find to have sex with. Right? Many sexual communities have become dramatically more active thanks to online or social media technology. Asexual people, for example, there's a massive portion of the LGBT community that really have found their identity recently via online communication forums. Sexual subcultures, given here are just a couple of examples. There are many more sexual subcultures. There are so many of them, both online and in the real world. Here, what I'm talking about are just a few examples. So first, furries. At the most simple definition, these people are mascot suit enthusiasts, right? They like to dress up like fuzzy stuffed animals, effectively. Like a mascot. Like a sports mascot. Now, furries are not an inherently sexual subculture. There are people that are sexually aroused by the fursuits. There are people that are completely not, it's not a sex thing at all. Furry culture is not inherently queer, but it is very open to expressions of gender identity. And their identity in the costume, sometimes it's known as a fursona, like a persona with fur, fursona. Again, those are not inherently sexual, but sometimes they are. And much of this subculture centers around large conventions, effectively when people can get together and dress up in their outfits. There's a very large one in Pittsburgh, near where I grew up, and it's so fascinating to watch the furry community interact with the greater Pittsburgh community, very kind of classically masculine community. It's fascinating, but it's not inherently sexual, but yes, there certainly is some sex associated with it. Now, a more inherently sexual community, the bear community within the gay male community. These are large, hairy, typically hairy, muscular men who are attracted to other large, hairy men. And this is it's a very sexual subculture. It is hard to For example, Google image search bear community and not find sexual pictures. These terms are used to describe both the physical characteristics of the men and their sexual activities. So a bear, this guy right here, he would be a bear. Other people in that community, pups, are younger men who are bears. Often, bears are a little bit older. Not necessarily, but usually in their 30s or 40s maybe. Otters is another group within the bear community. These are skinny, hairy bears. Yeah, a lot of this is about body type and what your body looks like, which is, again, interesting conversations to have as to what exactly that means. But, I mean, it's very much about physical acts of sex. So, I mean, to a given degree, if you want to talk about that stuff, you're talking about people's bodies. Another community within the sexual subculture is the BDSM community, which stands for Bondage, Domination, Sadomasochism. This is one that I could not find a picture that would be in any way appropriate. This is effectively sex with some pain component involved. I have a friend who is a scholar in this regard, and she said, well, it's not necessarily always sexual. Sometimes it is just about spanking, right? But, so, sex doesn't necessarily associated with it, and it appears brutal, but it's based on heavy consent, right? It's based on safe words. It's based on contracts with other people, right? Within the BDSM community, there are people known as subs, subordinates. They're the ones who are punished or controlled by the dom, who is the one who controls or is punished. Subs and doms may swap roles, but certain people do have distinct preferences in these sexual practices. A pop culture reference would be 50 Shades of Grey, right? This is but it's been heavily criticized by the BDSM community because of the coercion that the protagonist undergoes, right? The protagonist in that book is not really, at a lot of times, doesn't really want to go along with the sexual activity of the antagonist. He classifies as an antagonist, right? And the fact that she's been coerced, and the fact that a lot of the sexual activities portrayed in that book don't reflect what actually happens in BDSM has been criticized by that community in that regard. So yeah, BDSM is really about sexual kind of stuff, but that doesn't mean that the people involved in that community don't have very specific opinions about how they're portrayed in the media, which it's interesting. Another sexual subculture are drag queens / kings. Drag queens are typically queer, but not always. And this is not, again, just like furries, this isn't really about sex. It's more about presentation and gender identity. But it centers for drag, it centers on the show. And usually a drag show is about musical performance or some sort of actual performance, typically musical. Drag is one of the oldest uniquely queer art forms, and a pop culture most of us recognize is RuPaul and RuPaul's Drag Race. This has really turned drag into kind of a mainstream concept, which in terms of studying sexuality is dramatically interesting. Okay, that is it for this lecture. Yeah, fascinating stuff. Let's talk about it in those discussion boards and elsewhere.